Ladies and gentlemen, how many people in here think Christianity is actually true? All right? That God does exist, Jesus did rise from the dead, and we have an accurate copy of what he actually said and did. You believe that's the case? Well, a lot of people don't think it's true. After all, it was written down by religious people. And we know religious people tend to embellish things. They make things up. And it's got miracles in it, like a resurrection. All right, how many people in this room have ever seen someone rise from the dead after you knew that they had been dead for at least 36 hours? Crickets. Yet if you're a Christian, you have to believe something that none of us here have ever seen. How rational is that? Well, I actually think it's quite easy to show that Christianity is true. You only need to answer 4 questions. In other words, if you investigate these 4 questions, I think you'll realize that the answer to these 4 questions is yes. And if the answer to these 4 questions is yes, then Christianity is true. What are the 4 questions? Here are the 4 questions. Some pretty grooving music, isn't it? Yeah. That is actually from our TV show, which is on every Wednesday nights here. It'd be, 7 p.m. On DirecTV channel 378. How many people here have DirecTV? DirecTV, can I see? Like 6 of us. Come on, friends don't let friends watch cable. All right, how many people have Roku? Anyone have Roku? All right, good, Roku. If you go to Roku and look for NRB, for National Religious Broadcasters, you can watch the show there. We're also on radio every Saturday mornings, a number of stations around the country, but it's podcasted, so you can listen to it anytime you want. It's called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. The podcast, we release one on Friday and one on Tuesday. Now, why are these the 4 questions? Truth, God, miracles, and the New Testament. Now, you know, tonight we're talking about miracles and evidence for the resurrection. But we've got to kind of give you the whole big picture before we get to those, because it matters whether or not truth exists and God exists before you can believe it's true that miracles have occurred or that Jesus rose from the dead. So the first question, does truth exist? Why is that important? Because you hear people saying there's no truth. You got your truth, I got my truth. All truth is relative, right? Well, if there's no truth, Christianity can't be true. Of course, if there's no truth, atheism can't be true either, right? In fact, if there was no truth, would you ever go to school? I mean, what's the point? Would you ever read a book? Would you ever go to church? Of course there's truth. In fact, if there was no truth, could you ever catch anyone in a lie? I mean, lies presuppose truth, right? Of course. So we're going to deal with that question very briefly first. Second question, does God exist? That's important because if there's no God, Christianity can't be true. I'm going to mention tonight, just briefly, 3 arguments for the existence of God. These arguments are taught in the Bible, but you don't need the Bible to know them. In fact, you can show that God exists without any reference to any religious writing. Because God has written 2 books. Yes, he's written the Bible through people, but he's also written the book of nature. And when you look at nature, you can see there's a cause behind nature. Third question, are miracles possible? We'll spend more time on that because that's what we're doing tonight. And a lot of people don't think miracles are possible, but I hope to show you tonight that not only are miracles possible, but the greatest miracle in the Bible has already occurred, and even atheists are admitting the data for this miracle. We'll see that tonight. Then we're going to get to the key question, is the New Testament true, particularly with regard to the resurrection? Because if the resurrection occurred, game over, Christianity's true. Of course, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, game over, it's false. You might as well sleep in on Sunday and do what you want the rest of the week, because if Jesus hasn't risen from the dead, your faith is in vain. And Paul actually says this in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Yeah! She is a real pro. Keeping up with this guy from Jersey. Now, Paul actually says that if Christ hasn't risen from the dead, your faith is in vain. Now, if Jesus has risen from the dead, we can show the whole Bible's true. You say, how so? Because if Jesus rose from the dead, then he's God. And whatever he teaches is true. Jesus taught the entire Old Testament as the Word of God, and he promised the New Testament. You say, why trust Jesus? Look, I just have a personal policy. If somebody predicts and accomplishes his own resurrection from the dead, I just trust whatever the guy says. All right? Now, the first 2 points we're going to go through very quickly because we don't have a lot of time. We can't spend a lot of time on it. But let's talk for a second about, does truth exist? You guys ready to go? All right, good. Now, whenever you start talking about truth, you always have to start with Jack Nicholson. Right? Because Tom Cruise had him on the witness stand and he said to him, Colonel, I want the truth. And Nicholson said, you can't handle the truth. Pastor Robert, these people must be from out of town. Because that was the lamest you can't handle the truth I think I've ever heard. He didn't say it that way. He didn't say, you can't handle the... If he had said it that way, the movie would have gone nowhere. Here's how he said it.
I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
All right, let's try it again. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. Now that felt better, didn't it? Didn't you always want to do that in church? You can't handle it. Well, there's a lot of people that can't handle the truth. They're saying, you got your truth, I got my truth, all truth is relative. Now look, when somebody says there is no truth, you just need to ask them one question. What should the question be? Is that true? Is it true that there's no truth? Because if it's true that there's no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true. Did I say that right? I know that can give you intellectual constipation if you think about it long enough. But that's because this is a self-defeating statement. You notice, to say there's no truth violates itself. It's claiming it's true, there are no truths. It's violating the law of non-contradiction. It's one of the fundamental laws of all logic. And the reason why people don't get this stuff is because they've never taken a class in logic. In fact, how many people in here have taken a class in logic? Can I see your hands, please? Ladies and gentlemen, you see here are our homeschoolers right here. Here they are. Because if we taught logic in public school, a lot of the nonsense that people are walking away from public school with would no longer be the case. People would realize much of what they're saying is false. And what you want to do when somebody utters something like this is to turn the claim on itself. So somebody says there's no truth, you turn the claim on itself and you say, is that true? Somebody says there are no absolutes. What are you going to say? Are you absolutely sure? Right? Somebody says you ought not judge. What are you going to say? Then why are you judging me for judging? You see, it's a judgment. Jesus didn't say don't judge and stop right there. He said judge not, lest you be judged. By the same standard you judge others, you be judged by that standard. So before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, you hypocrite, which is a judgment, take the log out of your own eye first. So it's not a command not to judge, it's a command on how to judge. In other words, I wish we had more time to spend on this, but we don't. Relativism and postmodernism is self-defeating because they claim it's true that there is no truth. That's obviously nonsense. So truth does exist. The next question, is it true that God exists? And I mentioned 3 arguments. I'm just going to briefly mention them here. We don't have time to go into it because we got to get to miracles in the New Testament. But in order for miracles to be possible, God has to exist, right? So let's look at the evidence for God very briefly. And I said there are 3 arguments for God that we'll talk about. There's more than this, but these are the 3. The first is the argument from the beginning of the universe, known as the cosmological argument. And cosmological just comes from the Greek word cosmos, which says that there must be a world out there that had a beginning. This is what the argument says. If the world had a beginning, if the universe had a beginning, there must be a beginner. The second argument for God is known as the teleological argument. That's the argument from design. And it says if there's design in the universe and design in life, there has to be a designer. Now, these two arguments have some scientific evidence behind them. The third argument doesn't have any science behind it, yet it's the argument you've all known since you were a very small child. It's the argument from morality known as the moral argument. And it says if there's one thing morally wrong out there, just one, like it's wrong to torture babies for fun, or it's wrong to murder 6 million people in a Holocaust, then there has to be a God. Why? Because if there is no standard beyond humanity, then everything's just a matter of opinion. That would just be your opinion against a baby torturer's opinion, or your opinion against Hitler's opinion. Well, we know torturing babies for fun is not just a matter of opinion. Murdering people is not just a matter of opinion. If that's the case, there must be a standard beyond us, a standard of righteousness and justice that we're obligated to obey. That standard is what we mean when we say God exists. His nature is that standard. And any deviation from that standard would be what we would call evil. So we know certain things are right and other things are wrong, so that standard must exist. Now, we don't have time to talk about that. I just want to spend just a minute on the first argument. Now, you got to admit it was worth coming back here tonight just to see God do that. Some of you, I said, I've never seen God move. Oh, really? Check this out. Look at that. Now, this is the argument that many say points back to the Big Bang. Now, I know some of you are here going, Frank, we're Christians here, and we don't believe in the Big Bang. You guys don't believe in the Big Bang? I believe in the Big Bang. I just know who banged it. In fact, the evidence for the Big Bang, for the beginning, is so good that even atheistic scientists are admitting it. Stephen Hawking, who was probably the top physicist in the world until he died about 5 years ago, he was an atheist, but he said this: almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Now think about this, ladies and gentlemen. Well, first of all, Hawking tried to come up with another explanation other than God. He failed. But think about this. If this is really true, and that's what the evidence seems to suggest, that, yeah, the universe had a beginning, that space, time, and matter came into existence out of nothing, what could have caused space, time, and matter to come into existence out of nothing? Only something that transcends space, time, and matter. In other words, the cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create, because to go from a state of nothingness to a state of creation, someone had to make a choice, and only persons can make choices. This cause would also have to be intelligent to have a mind to make a choice. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when you think about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause, who do you think of? God. You say, how do you know it's the Christian God, Frank? We don't. Yet, this could be Allah or some other theistic God. But if we keep going through the questions, if we go to are miracles possible, and is the New Testament telling the truth about Jesus, and we realize that Jesus rose from the dead, then we can go back and say that the same being that walked out of the tomb 1,990 years ago is the same being in whose divine nature created the universe out of nothing. We haven't gotten there yet, but we've got 6 attributes of what could be the God of the Bible. You with me so far? All right. Now, I'm leaving a lot of evidence out, but we got to get to the 2 questions we're here to look at tonight, and that is, are miracles possible, and is the New Testament true? Let's say we have evidence that there's some kind of cause out there. Seems like we do. How can we tell this is the Christian God? That's where miracles come in. All right, let me ask you a question. Let's go back, say, 500 years ago, before there were any mass communications. If one king wanted to communicate with another king across a great distance, how could he do it? What would he send? A message, right? And what would be on that message to let the receiving king know the message came from the first king? Right, there would be a seal on that message that would authenticate that the message came from the first king. Now, it seemed to me that seal would have to have a couple of qualifications or a couple of characteristics. Number one, it would have to be unique to the king, right? Because if everyone had the seal, then you could send false messages from the king. You wouldn't know if it really came from the king. And number two, it would have to be difficult to forge. Because if you could forge the seal, again, you could send false messages from the king. Seems to me that this is what miracles are and what they do, particularly in the Bible. They're like a seal from the great king. They say, listen to this person. I'm doing miracles through this person, so you will know he speaks for me. Now, basically what we're saying here is that in biblical times, the miracle confirms the message, the sign confirms the sermon. Now, how many miracles are there in the Bible, approximately? Anyone? This is the interactive portion of the program. How many? 500? 365, one a day. The number of miracles in the Bible, depends on how you count them. Some of them are bunched up, but basically it's about 250. I mean, we think miracles are occurring all the time. Actually, they're not. 250 miracles in the Bible. In fact, let's take the history of the Bible. Let's just go from Abraham to Jesus. I know there's miracles on each side of that, but let's just make the math easy. That's about 2,000 years from Abraham to Jesus. If you spread 250 miracles over 2,000 years, how often do you get a miracle? Homeschoolers, help us out. How often? One every what? Once in a blue moon. You must be a math major. Okay. 250 into 2,000 is 8. Thank you, homeschooler. We get one miracle every 8 years. Does that sound like a lot? No. But do they happen every 8 years? You get a miracle, 8 years later, you get another one, 8 years later. No, they occur in bunches. In fact, when God is doing miracles through people in the Bible, he's doing them in 3 basic time periods around Moses, Elijah, and Jesus and the apostles. Why? Because these people have new revelation that needs new confirmation. There's a new message that needs a new miracle. There's a new sign, or a new sermon, I should say, that needs a new sign. This is how people are going to know that these people speak for God. Why is Pharaoh going to believe me, says Moses. I'm going to be able to do some miracles through you. He'll eventually catch on. Yeah. Why are the people going to listen to Elijah and Elijah? Because they can do miracles. Why are they going to listen to Jesus and the apostles? Because God is pouring out miracles through these people to authenticate them, to show that they truly speak for God. You realize there are periods of hundreds of years. There's no miracles because there's no new revelation that needs new confirmation. Now, we need to keep that in mind as we look at the possibility of miracles. The problem is that some people today, in fact, many people today, think miracles are impossible. For example, the Noah miracle. Is this being live streamed, by the way? Can we just keep this between ourselves? Can we all agree, can we just admit it, Christians, that the Noah story is crazy? Thank you. And how about resurrections? I already asked, has anyone seen a resurrection? Everyone said no. Yet we have to believe it to be Christians. And for some reason, the big problem miracle in the Bible is Jonah. Is that a whale of a tail or a tail of a whale? I mean, what is the deal with Jonah? Can you really actually believe in Jonah? Well, ladies and gentlemen, what is the greatest miracle in the Bible? Yeah, it's not the resurrection. Actually, the greatest miracle in the Bible is the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Because if that verse is true, every other verse is at least possible. And here's the interesting thing. Even atheists are admitting the evidence for the first verse. Again, they don't think it's God, but what else could it be? If Genesis 1:1 is true, every other verse in the Bible is at least possible. Right? I mean, that's the greatest miracle of all, to create the universe out of nothing. I mean, if God can create the universe out of nothing, can he walk on water? Can he raise Jesus from the dead? Can he part the Red Sea? Can he make axe heads float in water? I mean, this is easy. For God to create the universe out of nothing. Now, I just said something you might not agree with. I just said God can do whatever he wants. It's not logically impossible. Some of you are going, I thought God can do anything. No, there's many things God can't do. He can't do logically impossible things, like he can't create a married bachelor. I know some guys try, but no. He can't create a one-ended stick. He can't create a square circle. He can't create a five-sided triangle. He can't create an honest politician. I mean, there's some things that are just too hard for God. In fact, you can do some things that God can't do. What can you do? Lie. You can change. God can't. If he could do those things, he wouldn't be the standard of truth or the standard of perfection. So God can do anything that's logically possible, but God can't do what is logically impossible. Logic flows from his nature. So if God can create the universe out of nothing, can he do any of these other miracles? Of course he can. Of course Noah's crazy, unless God exists. Of course resurrections don't occur, unless God exists. Of course Jonah's a myth, unless God exists. Now, we need to say a couple more things about miracles, and that is a lot of people don't believe in miracles because they've never seen one. That's not a good reason necessarily to disbelieve in something. Why? Because you believe in a lot of things you've never seen. You believe in your mind. Have you ever seen it? You're using it right now, I hope. You believe in the laws of logic and the laws of mathematics. Have you ever seen those? You're using them right now. You believe in justice. Have you ever seen justice? No, justice is not something you see. You may have seen people treated justly or unjustly, but you've never seen justice because it's grounded in the nature of God. It's an immaterial virtue. You've never seen love. And everyone in here believes in love. But you've never seen it. Years ago, I had a couple of debates with Christopher Hitchens. You guys remember Christopher Hitchens? He was a brilliant British atheist who sounded more brilliant than he was because he had a British accent. Anyway, in our second debate at the College of New Jersey, some student asked Christopher this question: Christopher, what is love? And Christopher, being a materialist, in other words, he thought there's no immaterial reality, everything's just made of molecules. He had to come up with a materialistic answer. So he finally said, love is a chemical. And I said, don't tell that to your wife. Honey, do you love me? Yeah. Why? Because I got the chemical today. I mean, tomorrow I might not have it. No, love is not a chemical. It's grounded in the nature of God. It's a virtue. You've never seen gravity. Oh, Frank, come on. You're not seeing gravity. What are you seeing? You're seeing the effects of gravity. We really don't even know what gravity is. You know that? In fact, by the way, if someone ever asks you, how do you know that God exists? Here's what I think you ought to say. I know God by his effects. I'm going to reason from effect back to cause. If there's a creation, and there is, that's the effect, I've got to reason back to a cause, a creator. If there is design in the world and design in life, that's the effect, I'm going to reason back to a cause, a designer. If I have a moral law written on my heart, that I intuitively know certain things are right and other things are wrong, that's the effect. I'm reasoning back to a cause, a moral lawgiver. If I have the capacity to know things outside of my skull, that my senses can get information from the outside world, and then I can use these laws of logic to draw true conclusions outside of my skull, that's the effect. I have to reason back to a cause of mind. If there's evidence that a man actually predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead, that's the effect. I have to reason back to a cause, someone who could have done that. God. In other words, you're always reasoning from effect to cause. In fact, if you think you've had a personal experience with God, that God told you something, that's an effect. And you're reasoning back to a cause. This effect came from God. You're always reasoning from effect to cause. That's what scientists do. They see effects and they try and say what caused it. So ultimately, we're reasoning from effect back to cause. And what you ought to do with your young people is enhance their intuition that every effect must have a cause. Because little kids know this. They know things don't pop into existence out of nothing. They know every effect has a cause. And you can't go on an infinite regress of causes. You're ultimately going to get back to an uncaused first cause. And think about this, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to get the who made God question. Well, if space, matter, and time had a beginning, what could have created that? Something spaceless, timeless. If you're timeless, do you have a beginning? No, you're uncaused. You're the uncaused eternal being. So you're reasoning from effect to cause. You've never seen George Washington, yet you believe he existed. Why? Because he's left effects behind that are best explained by a cause known as George Washington, who lived from 1732 to 1799. You've never seen Jesus in the flesh either. But you have evidence that he exists. Why? Because he's left effects behind that are best explained by Jesus himself. So you're always reasoning from effect back to cause. Now, one more thing about miracles. So the bottom line is you believe in a lot of things you've never seen. One more thing about miracles is people say, well, if I haven't seen it, I won't believe it. Well, look, even if miracles occur today, and I think they do, but even if they don't, so let's say miracles haven't occurred since Jesus and the apostles. Is Christianity still true? Yes. Do you know what for atheism to be true? Every single spiritual experience and miracle claim in the history of the world has to be false. Is that possible? It's possible. Is it reasonable to believe? No. No, of course not. Everyone has been wrong, whether the effect came from the dark side or the light side, so to speak. But look, even if miracles occur today, they have to be rare. Why? Because if they occurred all the time, we wouldn't recognize them as miracles. They wouldn't have their special effect on us. I mean, imagine if people rose from the dead routinely. What would the resurrection of Christ mean to us? Nothing. You go to somebody and you go, Jesus rose from the dead to prove he was God. And the guy goes, so what? Uncle Leroy just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago. Now I got to give the inheritance back. No. It's got to be a rare event if it's going to get our attention. You ought not expect to see a lot of miracles, even if they occur today. They've got to be rare. The only way you can recognize them is against the backdrop of regular natural events. There are things that happen every day that we probably should call miraculous, but we don't because they happen every day. But there's truly design behind them. How many people in here, and every mother should raise their hand, it's only some of the guys that need to raise their hand. How many people in here have seen your own flesh and blood born? Your own flesh and blood either come out of your body or the body of your wife. Now when you see that, you don't go, evolution, right? You go, there's got to be some intelligence behind this. This is amazing. Now we don't call it a miracle because it happens every day. But there is intelligence behind it. Now, there's a lot more in the book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist on miracles, but we got to move on to the key question, is the New Testament true? Particularly with one, well, first of all, if God exists, miracles are possible, right? Now we're just going to see if another miracle has occurred, at least one, since the creation of the universe, okay? And that miracle is the resurrection. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Now, in the book, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, and Stealing from God, we have at least 10 different reasons we ought to believe that the New Testament writers are telling the truth. We don't have time for all that tonight. We're just going to look at two. And the first one I want to look at is something called embarrassing stories. Embarrassing stories. Why? Because historians know if there's something embarrassing to the author or authors, it's probably true. Why would it be true? Because you're not going to invent things that make you look bad. You might invent things that make you look good, but you're not going to invent stories or details that embarrass you. In fact, let me ask you guys a question in here. How many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look good? If you don't have your hand up right now, you're lying to make yourself look good, and it's not working. We know you're lying. All right, how many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look bad? No, you don't do that. You might lie to make yourself look good, but you won't lie to make yourself look bad. Well, the New Testament writers have filled the New Testament with embarrassing stories and details that make them look bad, that embarrass embarrasses them. That's why we call this the duh factor. They're not making this up. Let me just give you a few of these. Peter, their leader, is called Satan by Jesus. Do you think they invented this? Do you think Mark, who recorded this, at one point said to Peter, hey, Pete, I'm going to make this a real interesting story. I'm going to have the Lord call you Satan. What do you think Peter would have said? Have him call you Satan. Look, I'm the leader here. This doesn't look good. And then Peter says, oh, Lord, I'll never deny you. What does he wind up doing? He denies him 3 times. And then at the crucifixion, all the disciples, maybe with the exception of one, they all run away. They're cowards. This is like a Monty Python movie. Run away. They all run away. And who are the brave ones? The women. The women are the brave ones. That's right, ladies. You can give yourselves a hand. I am woman, hear myself roar. Now, who wrote the New Testament down? Men. Now, what man is going to invent that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb? Would any man in here invent this? No, if I was there and I was inventing it, I'd make myself look good, wouldn't you? I'd write something down like this. Let's say we marched right down there and we overpowered that elite Roman guard. Yeah, that sounds good. What do you think? Yep. John said, get out. Peter roundhouse kicked him. Thomas said, we'll be back. No doubt. And then on Sunday morning, we marched right down to the tomb, and we saw Jesus, who congratulated us on our great faith. And then we went and comforted the trembling women. I would never say it was Mr. Sissy Pants. Why the women went down and discovered the empty tomb. And oh, by the way, why would you never say the women were the first witnesses in that culture? I mean, forget about the fact that it was embarrassing to men. It was. But independent of that, why would you never say the women were the first witnesses in that culture? That's because a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. So if you're making up the New Testament story, you'd only have the men be the first witnesses. Yet all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which is telling us what? They really were. In fact, one of them was a formerly demon-possessed woman. Gee, what a credible witness you got there. They're not making this up. I actually had a lady come up to me once, and she said, Frank, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. I said, that is an excellent point. I had not thought of that. Because ladies, when your man comes home from work, does he say much? There could have been a nuclear explosion down at the plant. He's not going to tell you. You'll see it on the news before you hear it from him. You'll be watching the news going, hey, hon, what happened? Oh, yeah, forgot to tell you. The nuke blew up. I've been hot for 3 days. What's for dinner? He's not going to tell you. In fact, I can't even believe this next verse is in the New Testament, but it is. You know the end of the Gospel of Matthew? This is the Great Commission. Matthew 28, where Jesus takes his disciples up on a mountain in Galilee and gives them the Great Commission. You know the Great Commission? Go, therefore, make disciples of all nations. Notice he doesn't say make believers. There's a difference, right? Make disciples. Anyway, it says right in the text, as Jesus is giving his disciples the Great Commission, right there in verse 17, it says about the disciples, some believed, but some doubted. What? He's standing resurrected right in front of them, and some are doubting. It's like they're standing there going, you see that guy over there? Yep. That guy over there is Jesus. Oh, no, it can't be Jesus. He was just killed not long ago. No, I'm telling you, it's him. Look, Jesus is dead. The Romans killed him. He's not here anymore. No, it's him. Look, they whipped him. They put nails in him. They punctured his heart. Jesus is dead. In fact, if he wasn't dead and he survived, the Roman soldiers themselves would have been killed. It's him. It can't be. It is. How do you know? The women told me. They're not making this up. There's even potentially embarrassing details about Jesus in the text. In Mark chapter 3, it says his own family thinks he's out of his mind. They want to seize him and take him home. You may have heard the scholars say that the New Testament writers invented Jesus to be God. Oh, really? Then why is Mark chapter 3 in there when his own family thinks he's crazy? And Mark is almost universally recognized to be the earliest gospel. Jesus is called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. Do you think they made this up? He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. And oh, by the way, notice there are two prostitutes in Jesus' bloodline. Who are they? Rahab and Tamar. Now, do you think Matthew and Luke, when they wrote down the genealogy, said, you know what, I really think we ought to spice up the Messiah's bloodline a little bit. Let's put a couple of prostitutes in there. Rahab, Tamar. This is good stuff, isn't it? In fact, there's a lot of shady people in the bloodline. Judah, from where we get the term Jew from. Jesus, from the tribe of Judah. Not a good guy. He's the guy that sold his own brother into slavery. Joseph, in the Old Testament, Judah's the guy that did that. David's in there. David, a man after God's own heart. Yeah, but he's a liar, adulterer, and a murderer. Gee, I guess there's hope for the rest of us then, huh? Bathsheba's in there. In fact, when Matthew gets to Bathsheba in the genealogy, he won't mention her name. What does he say instead? Uriah's wife. He's telling the truth, but it's a slam. Do you see this? Uriah was the husband of Bathsheba, whom David had killed so he could cover up his sin and have Bathsheba. They're not sugarcoating it. They're telling the truth. They're not making this up. And then he's hung on a tree. Why is he hung on a tree? Anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse, according to Deuteronomy 21:23. If you're making up a Messiah to the Jews, you don't hang him on a tree. But he was hung on a tree. Now, what are the two trees you see in Genesis? The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Then go all the way to Revelation. What do you find at the end of Revelation? What tree is left? Tree of life. What's the tree in the middle? It's the tree they hung Jesus on. Because we sinned at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the only way we could get access to the tree of life is if Jesus takes our punishment on himself on the tree upon which he was hung. Otherwise, we don't get access to the tree of life. The Bible's very symmetrical. Do you notice this? In fact, it starts with a wedding, it ends with a wedding. It starts with a tree, it ends with a tree. Yet it's written by 40 different people over 1,500 years. Now, there's much more on embarrassing stories and testimonies in the books, but we got to move on. One more, and that is excruciating deaths. And this is the argument that says that these men who were in a position to know whether Jesus had resurrected from the dead or not died excruciating deaths when they could have saved themselves by saying, look, it never happened. Now, when we think about this, we've got to realize that all the writers of the New Testament are all Jews who believe in Yahweh. The only exception to that is Luke. He's the only Gentile. Everyone else believes they're part of God's chosen people, and they've got a tradition that goes back 2,000 years. There's two things they didn't believe. They didn't believe a man could claim to be God. That was blasphemy. And they didn't believe a man would resurrect from the dead in the middle of time. They knew we'd all resurrect from the dead at the end of time, according to Daniel 12, but they didn't think one guy would do it in the middle of time. Yet, that's exactly what they said happened. In fact, let's look at the apostles' beliefs and practices before and after the resurrection, because this will tell you that something dramatic happened. Before the resurrection, they believed in animal sacrifice. They've been slaying lambs to Yahweh for hundreds of years. Then suddenly Jesus comes along and they go, we don't need to slay these lambs anymore because these lambs are just symbols of the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Here he is. Before they believed in a binding law of Moses. Afterwards, Christ's life fulfills the binding law of Moses. Before they believed in strict monotheism. Afterwards, they're believing in a Trinity. 3 persons in one divine essence. Yes, you can see the Trinity in the Old Testament, but it's much clearer in the New. Before they believed in the Sabbath. In fact, they thought they could be stoned for not obeying the Sabbath. After, they're worshiping on Sunday, and Paul even says, don't let anyone tell you you have to obey any Sabbath or festival day. Why? Because the Sabbath has arrived. Who's our rest? Jesus is our rest. Out of the 10 commandments, 9 of them are repeated in the New Testament. There's only one that isn't. Keep holy the Sabbath. Because Jesus has arrived and we don't work. He's done all the work. We rest in him. Before they believed in a conquering Messiah, afterwards a sacrificial Messiah. Oh, Jesus will conquer when he comes back. That's why that young girl earlier today asked that God of war question. Yeah, when God comes back, the Lamb's going to be angry. Get ready. Before they believed in a circumcision, afterwards they believed in baptism and communion. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what would have caused these pious Jews who thought they were God's chosen people for about 2,000 years to abandon everything on the left and adopt everything on the right virtually overnight? The only thing I can think of is what psychologists call an impact event. What's an impact event? An impact event is an event that occurs in your life that is so dramatic, so impactful, that although you might not remember what you had for breakfast this morning, you'll remember an impact event that occurred 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years if you're old enough. And these impact events can turn you around just like that. In fact, there's only a few people in this room that could probably answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If you can remember where you were and what you were doing November 22nd, 1963, raise your hand and hold it up high, please. Hold it up high. Ladies and gentlemen, you see these people with their hands up? These people are very old. November 22nd, 1963 is my earliest memory. Yes, I'm 61 years old now. I know. I don't look a day over 60. In fact, when I turned 50, my wife was very encouraging. She said, honey, you're going to live to be 100. I said, how do you know? She said, because you look half dead already. Anyway, November 22nd, 1963, I'm 2 years old and 2 days. I'm a toddler. I'm standing in our home in Wanamassa, New Jersey, in the living room, and my mother is sitting on an ottoman in front of a black and white TV, weeping uncontrollably. Mommy, what's the matter? What's the matter? They killed the president. They killed the president. President Kennedy assassinated that day. I can still see my mom right now in my mind, sitting on that ottoman, when she was 26 years old. She's 85 now. But I can see her when she was 26. It was an impact event. I had never seen my mom cry like that. And so it made an impression on me. That's my earliest memory. I don't remember anything before that and very little after that. Where were you when the second plane hit the tower? I was in my home in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had the TV on behind me. I'd seen the first tower had been hit. I didn't know by what. And I was on the phone to a pastor on the north side of Charlotte, and we were talking about what would the topic be if I came to the church and spoke. And I said, do you have the TV on? He goes, yeah. I said, maybe a Cessna hit the World Trade Tower. That had happened before, right? And so we're just talking, my back's still to the TV, and suddenly he screams into the phone. He goes, the second tower just got hit. I turned around, I look at the TV, the second tower's on fire. I said, was it a Cessna? He goes, no, it was like a United plane. It was a passenger plane. I go, you saw that? He goes, it was just on live TV. I said, look, let me call you back. I hung up the phone, and for some reason that morning I had CNN on. The Communist News Network. And I'm not making this up, but the commentator on CNN said, one has to think there's some sort of navigational error here. I said, you dimwit, this is the clearest day in the history of the Big Apple. What do you think, pilots can't see where they're going? I mean, you think Stevie Wonder's flying these planes? I mean, come on. This is terrorism. I called that pastor the next day. I said, we're going to come to your church and talk about Islam because that's what this is related to. Now, 9/11 was over 21 years ago. And those of you who are old enough can remember something about that day. But if I were to ask you where you were 21 days ago, most of you are going to go, let me look at my iPhone. What was I doing that day? Why can you remember something from 21 years ago but not 21 days ago? No impact event 21 days ago. Impact event 21 years ago. Do you think if Jesus really rose from the dead, that would have been an impact event? Do you think that those disciples would have suddenly gone, uh-oh, this is real? I mean, that's the only way I could figure out why they would have abandoned everything on the left and adopted everything on the right, just like that. Would they have any trouble remembering this? Would they have any trouble writing any of this down? No, they would have remembered it all. Because it was an impact event. In fact, think about this. What did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? What did they get by saying Christianity was true? Well, first of all, they got kicked out of the synagogue, and then they got beaten, tortured, and killed. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks. We're going to start a new religion. We are? Yeah. What's it going to get us? First we get kicked out of the synagogue, then we get beaten, tortured, and killed. Well, sign me up. What a great idea. Why haven't we thought of this earlier? No, I don't think so. They're not making it up. Now, sometimes I get the question, and maybe you do if you're a Christian, are there any non-Christian writers that talk about Jesus and the apostles? Yes, there are. They're not eyewitnesses, but we all have them listed in chapter 9 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. But you know what's kind of underneath that question? There's an illicit assumption. What's the illicit assumption? Well, you really can't trust the New Testament writers because the New Testament writers were biased, you see. They were Christians. You can only trust the secular or non-Christian writers to tell us really what happened. If you think about that for more than 5 seconds, you realize how stupid that objection is. What did the New Testament writers have to gain by making this up? They had every motive to say the resurrection did not happen, not every motive to say it did. Because by saying it did happen, they got no earthly reward. They got kicked out of the synagogue, beaten, tortured, and killed. I mentioned earlier today, my friend J. Warner Wallace, who's been on Dateline, as I say, more than any other cold case homicide detective, because he solves murders decades old. And we said earlier today that he says whenever he finds a dead body, he knows there's only 3 motivations for that guy being dead: sex, money, or power. Well, Jim says if you're going to say somebody invented the resurrection story, that these disciples invented this, you got to find one or more of those 3 motivators. Otherwise, there's no reason to believe they invented it. So let's take a look. Ladies and gentlemen, did the New Testament writers get real popular with the ladies for saying Jesus had resurrected from the dead? No, didn't get sex. Did they get money? No, they weren't 21st century prosperity gospel preachers in leisure suits, okay? Did they get power? No, they got the opposite of power. They were persecuted. Saul had power when he was persecuting the church. As soon as he became a Christian, he became Paul. He was the one persecuted. They didn't get sex. They didn't get money. They didn't get power. They're not making this up. In fact, then why would they die for a known lie? You say, wait a minute, Frank, time out. If you're going to say that Christianity proves, or if you're going to say that martyrdom somehow gives evidence to Christianity, don't you have to say it gives evidence to Islam? No. Why? Because there's a lot of differences between the Muslim martyrs of today and the New Testament martyrs of New Testament times. The Muslim martyrs of today haven't witnessed anything that tells them that Islam is true. They just have faith. The New Testament martyrs, on the other hand, witnessed Jesus rise from the dead. They touched Jesus. They ate with Jesus. They verified with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. Some people will die for a lie they think is the truth. Nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. And the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not, and they went to their deaths anyway. You can't get better evidence than that unless you were there yourself. Now, last thing on this. And this is going to sound heretical, Pastor Robert, for just a second, but it's not. Stick with me. Christianity is not true because a series of documents we put under one binding we call the Bible says it's true. In fact, Christianity would be true if the Bible never existed. You say, how can that be? Do you realize there were thousands of Christians before a line of the New Testament was ever written? How? Because they had witnessed the resurrected Jesus. or they knew people who had witnessed the resurrected Jesus. The documents were written down later. And you would not have documents written in the first century by Jews claiming that a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead, unless a man really did claim to be God and rose from the dead. In fact, we could put it this way. The New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. So keep it. That was a weaker applause than the CNN line. Okay, come on. You got to, yeah. You got to clap for Jesus, not against CNN. Okay, come on. No, the point here is that Christianity did not originate with a book. Christianity originated with an event, the resurrection. There would be no book, really series of books we put under one binding we call the New Testament, written by Jews in the first century, unless Jesus rose from the dead. You wouldn't even have these writings. They're virtually self-authenticating when you think about it. Why would people put themselves through this? They wouldn't. Now, thankfully, they chose to write it down through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit so we can know about it and order our lives according to it. But if they had never written it down, it would still be true. We just wouldn't know much about it. Does this make sense? Now, there's a lot more evidence we don't have time to get into, but in addition to embarrassing stories and excruciating deaths, we have early sources, eyewitness details, embedded confirmation, expected predictions, extra-biblical writers, and explosive growth. They're all alliterated because I used to be a Baptist. All right. So the big picture again is this. Does truth exist? The answer is, if somebody says there's no truth, you're going to say, is that true? Does God exist? Yes, we briefly mentioned three arguments for the existence of God: cosmological, teleological, and moral. Are miracles possible? What's the greatest miracle in the Bible? Creation, Genesis 1:1. If that verse is true, every other verse is at least possible. And did Jesus rise from the dead? Yeah, it appears he did. And if he did, then we can trust the New Testament. In fact, the New Testament is already trustworthy if we look at the documents. And then once we realize that Jesus did rise from the dead, whatever he teaches is true. So if you want to go further, there's that word and phone number again. If you want this presentation in a PDF format, the entire thing, not just the 12 slides I showed you, but the all 360, text the word evidence to this phone number. The books and the DVDs are back on the book table. We're now teaching online courses, by the way. I teach a number of them. Elisa Childers teaches one for us. Gary Habermas, who couldn't be here, but Gary was going to be here but couldn't make it. He teaches a course for us. There's many courses you can take on our website. Also, and our website's crossexamine.org, by the way. We're on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And in fact, we've actually combined these three into one social media platform. We call it You Twitface. It's kind of a Jersey thing. Have you signed up for You Twitface yet? We're also on Instagram and TikTok, by the way. You can see us there. Don't forget about the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. Also, we're on TV Wednesday nights here. It'd be 7 p.m. Mountain Time. And the free Cross-Examined app, if you don't do anything else, download the free Cross-Examined app. 2 words in the App Store, Cross-Examined. It not only has the podcasts on there, it's got the TV show streaming. There's even a quick answer section. So you might be having lunch with someone and they say something that's wrong about Christianity. You're not quite sure how to answer it. All you need to do is take out your iPhone or your Droid and go, hey, hang on, I'm getting a text. Hey, what about this? It's right there on your phone, all right? So download it. And for that, we got a few minutes for questions. Since no one likes to ask the first question, let's move right on to the second question right here. Second question, anyone? Right here. Come on up here, if you would. Walter, right? Okay. Go ahead. Walter asked a question earlier. Go ahead, sir.
Did all of the New Testament authors die as martyrs? That is,
not all the New Testament authors. We are pretty sure that 11 out of the 12 of the apostles did give their lives, but to be honest, the best evidence we have that we're virtually certain that they gave their lives were 4 of them. And that is Peter, Paul, and 2 James. The first James is in Acts 12. The second James is the half-brother of Jesus, who Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells was killed in 62 AD. He's the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. He's thrown off the Temple Mount, and he's then stoned to death by the Sanhedrin. So he, after not believing his own brother was God in 30 AD, is somehow dies as a martyr about 30 years later in the very city Jesus is alleged to have risen from the dead in. So those 4, Paul, Peter, James, and James, we have very good evidence for. We then have a next tier of apostles we have decent evidence for, and then a further tier that we don't really know. And the guy who's done a really good job on this is actually Sean McDowell. His PhD dissertation is, I think, called The Fate of the Apostles. And he went back and he tried to see how good evidence we have for these people dying, and that's basically what he came up with.
Thank you.
All right, good question. All right, anyone else? Anyone have any good jokes, perhaps? Come on. We got a free mic here. Yes, Christy, go ahead.
Thank you. What do you think is the biggest threat to Christianity today, and what do you recommend we do? What's our marching orders as you look at all the cultures and the worldview and everything coming? What do you wish Christians knew and would do?
All right, this is going to sound weird. The biggest threat to Christianity is prosperity. Because people get apathetic when they get, this is why Jesus said it's difficult for a rich man to get into heaven. Notice he didn't say it was impossible. Because if it was impossible, none of us would make it, right? But it's difficult. Why? Because when everything is going well, you don't think you need God. You got it all figured out. Everything's great. So prosperity tends to do that. And what follows with prosperity quite frequently is apathy. And you can find this cycle, by the way. There's nothing new under the sun, as Solomon said. You can find the cycle in the book of Judges, right? You know, when things get real prosperous, people get fat and they forget about God. Then disaster occurs. They repent. They come back to God. They get prosperous again, and they keeps going, right? So apathy is a big problem. How do you get people who don't care about Christianity to care? If I knew that, first of all, I'd be a billionaire. If I could get apathetic people to do something I wanted them to do, and secondly, everyone would be a Christian. But apathy is a big, big problem. Sometimes people will only get interested when some difficulty occurs. That's one reason why God doesn't leave all pain and suffering in our power. Sometimes when things go bad, they turn to God. In fact, how many people in here, by the way, came to Christ at least partially through pain and suffering? Can I see your hands, please? Okay, that's probably 30% of us. How many people in here have grown in Christ through pain and suffering? Yeah, that's all of us, right? In fact, let me do a quick little survey here. If anyone has a question, just come up to the mic. But let me just do a quick little survey here. This is just for the Christians. If you're not a Christian, not a question for you, but just for the Christians. Christians, I want you to think of somebody you know who's not a Christian whom you'd like to be a Christian. Friend, relative, somebody like that. Everybody got someone? Okay, don't point at them. All right. Here's my question. Is the person you're thinking of right now on a relentless pursuit of truth? They want to know if Christianity is true. Or are they apathetic or maybe even hostile to Christianity? How many people say the person I'm thinking of right now is on a relentless pursuit of truth? They want to know if Christianity is true. Crickets. How many people say the person I'm thinking of is apathetic or hostile? Yeah, look around the room. You see, the problem is most people are looking for God like a criminal is looking for a cop. They're on the run. They don't want it to be true because they want to be God over their own lives. That's why I always ask people, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? No. What do you do with somebody like that? You can do 4 things. You can pray for them. You can plant seeds every now and then. You can love them, which doesn't mean you approve of everything they do. As we talked about earlier, you need to stand in the way of evil, and then you can wait. Why? Because tragedy normally strikes all of us at some point. If they're ever going to be open, it's when tragedy strikes. When tragedy strikes, your phone's going to ring and that person's going to be on the other end. They're not going to call their atheist friend when things go down. What's the atheist going to say? Well, it's no rhyme or reason to anything. Stuff just happens. Get over it. No, they're going to call you a person of spiritual depth. When the student's ready, the teacher will appear. So pray, plant seeds, love, and wait. Because you can't, in fact, Pastor Robert said it earlier, right? You can't steer a parked car. Even God can't steer a parked car. If they're not interested, they're not interested. But you can reveal they're not interested by asking the question. If it were true, would you become a Christian? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
So the question I have, you came earlier today and at the beginning, I thought it went really different than I've ever seen one of these where, I guess my question is this, do you feel that God has given you a message, because this is a pastor's conference, is there something that God has laid on your heart to tell the pastors? Because I think these are really weird times that we're in. And I think, I don't see any strong leadership. And most of the pastors are here with their congregations or wherever they're at with their congregations, but you travel all over the place. So I guess I'm asking you, have you seen something going on recently that you feel that God has placed a certain message? Because you started this morning, and for lack of better terms, kind of scolding us, like you said, right? But I wanted to know, is there something more there?
Well, I will say that the people that are standing up, most of them are Calvary Chapel pastors, right? Robert is, Jack Hibbs, Rob McCoy. In fact, you know what happened in California during the lockdown. Oh, you got to shut down. Do you know when the separation of church and state is not in our Constitution? People think it is. Because Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote the letter to the Danbury Baptists in 1803, he was talking about a one-way wall of separation. He didn't want the state involved in the church. He wanted the church to influence the state, but not the other way around. Do you know what happened during the pandemic? The state told the church what to do. And a lot of pastors just said, oh, okay. Now, when it first happened, I think it was right to say, okay, 15 days to stop the spread, to tamp down the curve. But when we realized this isn't going the right way, pastor said we need to open. And so Jack Hibbs opened, you opened here, Rob McCoy out there in Thousand Oaks opened. In fact, Rob said to his wife, Michelle, he said, honey, I don't know what's going to happen here. We could lose everything if the governor really clamps down on us. What should we do? And she said to him, I'd rather be a widow than married to a coward. What I want to say is people need to follow the truth and need to be leaders and present the truth regardless of the consequences, right? Yes, hi, what's your name?
I'm Sophia. As a student leader, how would I explain to a second grader my evidence for how Jesus is real?
How would I explain to a second grader? Usually the second graders have the best questions, so like they had earlier, that's why I run for the hills when the second grader comes up to the microphone. I think you ought to trade on what I said before, that even second graders understand cause and effect, right? So if there are effects that need to be explained, what is the best explanation for the effects? Now, for a second grader, you can start with God. Does God exist? Well, look at the effects all around us. We're in effect. The universe is in effect. Natural laws are in effect. Orderliness is in effect. All that's in effect requires intelligence, ultimately God. Jesus rising from the dead. There's evidence, some of it we went through, that Jesus actually did rise from the dead. What could have caused someone to rise from the dead? Only someone like God. Now, it turns out we just created two curriculums. One is for 2nd to 5th graders, and the other is for 6th to 8th graders. And then, of course, we have one 9th grade and above called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. But if you go to our website, crossexamine.org, hit store, and you'll find these curricula, and they can help you teach this to the 2nd graders. Does that make sense? All right, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, so you said you wanted a good joke.
Oh, you got a good joke.
I have
okay.
one that kind
There
of
it is.
really fits. So it's the only one I remember. So what do you get when you have someone who's atheistic, apathetic, and dyslexic?
Go ahead.
Someone who doesn't know and doesn't care if there really is a dog.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you. So one atom said to another atom, I just lost an electron. And the first said to the second, are you sure? And the second said, I'm positive. That's my science joke. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
So in doing some street evangelism, I used to start with the question, do you think there's a God? And to start the conversation. And then after realizing many times it's a heart issue, I started bypassing the evidence and going to, if there was a God, would you be interested in knowing him?
Yeah.
At what point in your discernment for people that are sharing their faith, do you shift from the evidence to seeing that a person's heart is just bent against God?
I usually start pretty soon into the conversation, especially if it's on social media. You know how ornery people get on social media? And they'll say something and you'll give a reasonable answer to it and they're ignoring your answer and they're moving on to the next question, the next objection. At that point, you got to say, hey, mind if I ask you a question? If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian?
Sure.
And see what they say. Most of the time, they're going to hesitate or say no. In fact, there's a friend of mine, a pastor in Charlotte, had a big church, and he was preaching years ago on the new atheists, people like Hitchens and Dawkins and others, and why they were wrong. And some 20-year-old kid came up to him after the service and said, you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be telling people why the atheists are wrong. That's not loving. And of course, David said, no, it is loving. You got to tell people the truth. That's loving. If you don't tell them the truth, you're not loving them. And he had a couple of other objections to Christianity, and David began to answer the objections, and the kid was on to the next objection. And the kid also informed David he used to be a Christian, but now he's an agnostic. And so finally, after the kid kept moving the goalposts on him, David just took a shot at him and said, you know, I think you're an agnostic now because you're sleeping with your girlfriend. Am I right? Well, the kid turned white as a sheet because that's exactly what was going on. In fact, Gary Habermas, who's written books on doubt, has said people will call him because they're doubting, and they will say things like, I've been thinking, and Gary will stop him and said, no, you haven't been thinking, you've been sinning. That's why you have doubts now. Now, I'm not saying it's true of everybody, but 99 times out of 10, as they say in Mississippi, that's what's going on, right? It's not a head problem, it's a heart problem. They don't want it to be true. They're not on a truth quest, they're on a happiness quest. Sure. And they're just going to believe whatever they think is going to make them happy. Here's the problem. You can make yourself happy over the short term, doing a lot of fun, but selfish and sinful things, yet over the long term, it's a disaster. And everyone in this room who's over 40 knows what I'm talking about, because many of us have tried it ourselves, right? I'm going to do it my way and be happy. No, you're not. You're going to create a path of carnage behind you that ultimately is going to lead to broken relationships, addiction, loneliness, and probably premature death. You just can't live however you want. So I would start early by asking that question.
Yeah, no, I think that's appropriate. I think, in Romans when it talks about they love the lie more than the truth, that was the foundation of their minds being debased, right?
Yes.
And so, yeah, I think evidence and the heart are both two integrated pieces when sharing. I just think it's important for people to understand that. So, yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for evangelizing people. Yes, sir.
Through the years, I've at times asked people when did they stop believing, and they miss it, and they often chime in about their doubts. with that in mind, I'm curious what you have found leads most people to stray from believing, and if that's changed through the years.
Say that again. If most people, get a little closer to the mic if you would.
Yeah, what you see as the primary reason people leave the faith, and if that's changed through the years.
Well, deconstruction is a big hot topic right now, as you know, people deconstructing their faith. Before I get there, what people don't seem to realize is that when you deconstruct from one faith, you're automatically, and maybe not even knowing it, reconstructing another faith, right? You now have a new set of beliefs that you need evidence for, if you want to be reasonable about it. But deconstruction is a big deal. In fact, Robert mentioned earlier Elisa Childers' book. In fact, Elisa, myself, and Natasha will be here tomorrow, but we're going to be here, when is that, September? Yeah, September, we're going to do a conference called Unshaken. And it has a lot to do with people trying to leave the faith and deconstruction. And Elisa follows it a lot more closely than I do, but both her and I agree that I've never seen anyone ever claim to leave the Christian faith, to deconstruct themselves from the Christian faith, who didn't at some point say the sexual morality of the Bible they didn't like. It normally always goes back to that. And yet they have this moral standard that they think is true, but they have no grounds for this moral standard. Where are you getting this moral standard from? To say that certain people have a right to engage in certain sexual activity. To say anyone who says that's wrong is wrong. By what standard are you saying that? Where does that come from? They never ground the standard. It's just their opinion, but they think they're right about it. This is why I think non-Christians, particularly atheists, have to steal from God to argue against him. If there's no God, there is no right and wrong. There's not only no right to LGBTQ rights, there's no right to any sexual activity. There's not only no right to abortion, there's no right to life. There's no right to anything. It's just your opinion. So they have to saw off the branch upon which they sit in order to affirm their own worldview. Yes, sir.
Frank, I'm a pastor in Colorado.
Oh, thank you.
I thank you for being here. I thank you for teaching us. I thank you that you have a message and you brought it to us. And not only that our faith is real, but how to defend our faith in uncertain times. So thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
I'm highly encouraged
you.
By what you brought to us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. Well, we don't want to keep people too long, but I do need to tell you that I'm a new grandfather. Got 2 new grandsons. I've heard a new grandfather in our community that had a tragic peekaboo accident. They rushed him into the hospital, and he's in ICU right now. Some of you will get that tomorrow.